To really understand how these economic crises came about, we need to dive into Latin America's economic history and the factors that led to the massive turmoil of the 1980s, a time that changed everything for the developing world. This is when the economic strategies that many developing countries still follow today were first shaped, and it all began in Latin America. To help us unravel this story, we'll turn to Professor Martin Daunton, who gave an insightful lecture on Latin America's economic rise and fall. In the early 20th century, Latin American economies were thriving, primarily due to the export of raw materials and agricultural products like beef, coffee, and minerals to Europe and North America. In Argentina, the economy was dominated by large estates owned by a wealthy elite who had strong ties with foreign investors, especially from Britain. This export-driven model brought immense wealth, but also made these countries heavily dependent on global market fluctuations. Unlike nations like Canada and Australia, where land policies favored small family-owned farms, Latin American countries often had vast estates controlled by a few. Tenant farmers worked the land but had little chance of owning it themselves, leading to sharp social divisions and limited economic mobility for the majority. As the world economy evolved, especially after World War I and during the Great Depression, demand for Latin American exports plummeted. Countries faced falling commodity prices, reduced trade, and economic hardship. In response, many adopted a strategy known as import substituting industrialization, or ISI. The goal was to reduce reliance on foreign goods by developing domestic industries. Governments imposed high tariffs on imports and provided subsidies to local businesses. Initially, import substituting industrialization spurred industrial growth and created jobs. However, over time, these protected industries became inefficient due to lack of competition and innovation. The economies remained inward-focused and struggled to compete on the global stage. Political instability further complicated matters. Frequent government changes, corruption, and authoritarian regimes in countries like Argentina, Brazil, and others hindered consistent economic policies and deterred foreign investment. By the 1970s, many Latin American nations were borrowing heavily from international lenders, including large banks in the United States, to finance development projects and cover budget deficits. The surge in oil prices had led oil exporting countries to deposit large amounts of money in international banks, which in turn were eager to lend to Latin America. At first, these loans seemed manageable. Interest rates were low and the economies were growing, but in the late 1970s and early 1980s, things took a turn. Industrialized countries raised interest rates to combat inflation, causing borrowing costs for Latin America and other developing countries to skyrocket. Simultaneously, a global recession reduced demand for their exports. The tipping point came in 1982, when Mexico announced it could no longer meet its debt obligations. This sparked a financial crisis that quickly spread throughout Latin America. Countries like Brazil, Argentina, and others found themselves unable to service their debts. As we mentioned in our video on Africa's New Deal with China and the truth about China-Africa relations, this debt crisis in Latin America led the IMF and other international organizations to initiate what the IMF director, Michel Camdesas, termed a silent revolution. To truly grasp the impact of the Latin American debt crisis on the rest of the developing world, we need to explore how the events of the 1980s reshaped economic policies globally. Faced with crisis, international institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the US Federal Reserve stepped in. The immediate goal was to prevent a global financial meltdown. The US Federal Reserve organized emergency loans to help countries like Mexico meet their short-term obligations. However, these were just stopgap measures. To address the deeper issues, a more comprehensive solution was needed. In 1989, US Treasury Secretary Nicholas Brady introduced what became known as the Brady Plan. The Brady Plan aimed to reduce the debt burden of struggling countries by encouraging lenders to forgive a portion of the debt or restructure it on more favorable terms. But there was a catch. countries had to implement significant economic reforms to qualify for this debt relief. These reforms were outlined in a set of policies known as the Washington Consensus, coined by the economist John Williamson in 1989. The Washington Consensus consisted of 10 economic policy prescriptions that promoted free market principles. These included fiscal discipline by reducing budget deficits to control inflation, tax reform by broadening the tax base to increase government revenue without excessively raising tax rates, financial liberalization by allowing market forces to set interest rates to encourage saving and investment, exchange rate management by maintaining competitive exchange rates to boost exports, trade liberalization by reducing tariffs and quotas to encourage free trade, foreign direct investment by removing barriers to foreign investment, privatization by selling state-owned enterprises to private investors, deregulation, effectively reducing government intervention in the economy, property rights to strengthen legal protections of property ownership, and finally, reallocation of public expenditure, shifting government spending toward education, health, and infrastructure. The idea was that by adopting these policies, developing countries could stabilize their economies, promote growth, and become more integrated into the global market. In exchange for implementing these reforms, countries received debt relief under the Brady Plan. At first, this seemed like a win-win situation. Debt burdens would be reduced and economies would be restructured for long-term growth. However, the reality was far more complicated. Many countries faced significant challenges in implementing these reforms. Privatization sometimes led to job losses as state-owned enterprises were sold off. Deregulation and opening up markets exposed domestic industries to fierce foreign competition for which they were not always prepared. Furthermore, the emphasis on fiscal austerity, reducing government deficits, often led to cuts in social programs like education and healthcare, which disproportionately affected the poorest citizens. High unemployment and declining incomes became common, leading to social unrest. The impact wasn't limited to Latin America. The Washington Consensus became the blueprint for economic reform in many developing countries worldwide. Nations in Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe were encouraged, or in some cases required, to adopt these policies as conditions for receiving loans from the IMF and the World Bank, and to be eligible for participation in international trade under agreements facilitated by the World Trade Organization. Hey, if you like that video, click somewhere to the right of your screen to watch the full unfiltered version. All the best and thank you.